A lavish ceremony becomes ground zero for truth when twin DNA results crash an exclusive wedding. Within society's most prestigious venue, genetic proof transforms celebration into revelation. Between I do and I knew lies a story that proves timing is everything. As test results circulate among shocked guests, true inheritance claims its moment. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood Manor shimmered. Crystal chandeliers, like frozen waterfalls of light, cascaded over a sea of impeccably dressed guests. Eleanor Vance, breathtaking in her ivory gown, felt a tremor of unease beneath the surface of her carefully composed smile. The weight of the Thorne family's expectations pressed down on her, a gilded cage of their own making. She glanced at Julian, her fiancé, his handsome features betraying nothing of the turmoil within her. His smile was a mask, polite but distant. The air thrummed with a low hum of anticipation, punctuated by the clinking of champagne flutes. But for Eleanor, the music was a discordant symphony. She felt adrift in this sea of wealth and privilege, a stranger in a world she'd only ever observed from afar. The insecurities that had gnawed at her for years, buried beneath layers of carefully cultivated poise, threatened to surface. Then they arrived. Isabel and Marcus, twins whose presence was a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Their clothes were simple, elegant but understated, their eyes sharp and observant, taking in the extravagance with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. They seemed to radiate an aura of quiet defiance, a silent challenge to the gilded facade of this extravagant spectacle. Eleanor's breath hitched. Something in their gaze suggested they knew more than they were letting on. A silent understanding, a shared secret that hung heavy in the air. The champagne tasted like ash in her mouth. The joyous celebration suddenly felt suffocating. The beautiful, opulent scene started to feel like a trap. The twins, Isabel and Marcus, moved through the throng of elegantly dressed guests like phantoms. The murmur of conversation faded as they approached Eleanor, their presence a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Isabel's eyes, the same startling blue as Eleanor's, held a knowing glint. Marcus, his expression more guarded, stood a step behind. "Ms. Vance," Isabel began, her voice a low, melodious counterpoint to the champagne bubbles popping nearby. The scent of lilies and expensive perfume hung heavy in the air. Eleanor felt a tremor, a physical response to the twins' unnerving calm. You know me?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper above the gentle strains of the string quartet. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy between them, a palpable tension that crackled in the air like static electricity. Marcus stepped forward, his hand extending a slim, unmarked envelope. "We believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice smooth but firm. The crisp paper felt cool against Eleanor's trembling fingers. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat in the opulent silence. The gilded cage felt less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room for a verdict. What is this?" Eleanor's breath hitched. Her carefully constructed composure threatened to unravel. The sweet taste of fear filled her mouth, bitter and sharp. Isabel's smile was a thin line, devoid of warmth. "DNA results," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Regarding your parentage." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold, cutting through the lavish veneer of the celebration. The music seemed to falter, replaced by the sudden, hushed silence of a room holding its breath. Eleanor's carefully crafted smile fractured, replaced by a look of sheer terror. Julian, noticing the change in Eleanor, moved closer, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. The glittering ballroom suddenly felt suffocating, the vibrant colors dimming into a blurry, threatening kaleidoscope of her deepest fears made manifest. The celebration was over. The revelation had begun. The envelope felt slick with sweat in Eleanor's trembling hand. Julian, his face etched with worry, reached for it, but she recoiled, a low gasp escaping her lips. The opulent ballroom, moments ago a dizzying spectacle of light and laughter, now felt like a suffocating cage. The music, once a celebratory waltz, had dissolved into a dissonant hum, mirroring the chaos in her heart. Eleanor. Julian's voice was soft, laced with concern, but his touch remained hesitant. He knew something was terribly wrong. Isabel and Marcus watched, their expressions unreadable. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, the weight of their secret pressing down on everyone present. Eleanor's carefully constructed facade, the shimmering armor she'd worn for years, was shattering. The fear was palpable, a living thing coiling in her stomach. She tore open the envelope, her fingers clumsy and shaking. The crisp paper yielded to reveal the stark, clinical typeface of the DNA report. Her breath caught in her throat. The words blurred, then sharpened into agonizing clarity. She wasn't who she thought she was. Not at all. A sob escaped her lips, a fragile sound lost in the sudden hush of the room. The meticulously crafted champagne flutes, the shimmering gowns, the glittering chandeliers, all of it faded, blurring into an indistinct background as reality fractured around her. The weight of her carefully constructed life, built on a foundation of lies, threatened to crush her. The gilded cage had become a prison. Julian gently took her hand, his touch surprisingly firm. His eyes, usually guarded and distant, held a flicker of genuine concern. He saw the devastation in her eyes, the collapse of her carefully maintained composure. He saw the truth, raw and brutal, reflected in her face. The opulent setting, the celebratory mood, it all dissolved, leaving only the stark, painful reality. The shock, the betrayal, the fear. It was all too much. The carefully crafted illusion was gone, replaced by a terrifying, stark truth. The celebration had ended. The nightmare had begun. The silence hung heavy, thick as the scent of lilies and champagne. Eleanor stared at the report, the stark black letters swimming before her tear-filled eyes. The ornate ballroom, a testament to Julian's family's wealth, felt suddenly claustrophobic. Crystal chandeliers shimmered, mocking her internal collapse. Julian's hand, warm and surprisingly gentle, covered hers. His touch, usually reserved, held a tremor of uncertainty. He leaned close, his voice a low murmur meant only for her ears. "Eleanor, tell me." She couldn't speak, the words trapped in a throat constricted by sobs. She squeezed his hand, the pressure a silent plea for understanding, for solace. Isabel and Marcus stood apart, observing the unfolding drama with an unsettling stillness. Their earlier quiet confidence had morphed into something guarded, almost apprehensive. The weight of their revelation, the ripple effect of their carefully orchestrated plan, seemed to press down on them. Isabel's gaze flickered to Marcus, a silent exchange passing between them. A flicker of something akin to regret, or perhaps just weariness, crossed her face. Marcus remained stoic, his expression unreadable, yet his jaw was clenched tight, betraying his own turmoil. The facade of calm was crumbling, revealing the cracks beneath. A low gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Whispers, like rustling silk, snaked through the crowd. Eleanor's carefully constructed world was dissolving, the gilded cage bars now painfully visible. The meticulously crafted illusion of her perfect life, a life she desperately clung to, was shattering. The champagne flutes, once symbols of celebration, now felt like cruel reminders of the sham. It's not true," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising murmur of the crowd. The denial was a fragile shield, a desperate attempt to hold onto the semblance of her former self. Julian held her gaze, his eyes searching hers, attempting to decipher the truth hidden behind her tears. "Whatever it is, Eleanor, we'll face it together," he murmured, his voice laced with a sincerity she hadn't heard before. His touch tightened, a silent promise of support, a counterpoint to the unraveling of her carefully curated existence. The weight of the secret, the shattering of her identity, hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that promised further revelations. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of joy, now echoed with the chilling silence of a broken dream. The crystal glasses, half filled with untouched champagne, seemed to mock the sudden silence. A hush, thick and suffocating, descended upon the ballroom, replacing the lively chatter with a palpable tension. Eleanor's breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the opulent silence. The ornate ceiling, usually a breathtaking spectacle, now felt like a gilded cage pressing down on her. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now cloyingly sweet, mirrored the artificiality of her life. Julian's touch, though comforting, couldn't quell the tremors shaking her. His gaze, usually distant and controlled, held a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own inner turmoil. "Eleanor," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. He hesitated, searching for the right words that could possibly mend this shattering reality. Isabel watched, her earlier composure cracking. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the perfectly applied makeup. Marcus remained impassive, his jaw still clenched, but his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, held a flicker of something akin to remorse. The weight of their actions, the deception, seemed to bear heavily upon them. A ripple of whispers, like a poisonous vine, snaked through the stunned guests. Lady Beatrice Thorne, Julian's imperious mother, stared at Eleanor with undisguised disdain. The subtle disapproval she'd always held now blossomed into open contempt. The implications were devastating, reaching far beyond the immediate shock. This wasn't just about Eleanor's identity. It was about the Thorne family's reputation, their carefully cultivated image. Eleanor's gaze shifted from Julian's worried face to Isabel and Marcus, a silent accusation passing between them. The twins, their secret weapon now a double-edged sword, seemed to shrink under the weight of her unspoken judgment. Their carefully orchestrated plan, their calculated risk, had yielded far more chaos than anticipated. The victory, if it could even be called that, felt hollow and tainted. It's a mistake," Eleanor finally managed, her voice a frail whisper against the suffocating silence. The denial was a lifeline, a desperate clinging to the stability she'd always craved. But even as she uttered the words, she knew the truth was inescapable. The gilded cage, once a symbol of security, had become a prison, and the bars, once invisible, were now stark and unforgiving. The weight of her meticulously built life, the years spent striving for acceptance, threatened to crush her. The champagne, the music, the shimmering lights, all felt like cruel reminders of a life lived on borrowed time. The wedding, once a beacon of hope, now stood as a testament to a deception as grand as the venue itself. The silence stretched, a taut thread about to snap. Crystal chandeliers glittered, mocking the stark reality settling over the ballroom. Eleanor, pale as the lilies adorning the tables, clutched Julian's arm, her knuckles bone-white. His hand, usually cool and detached, trembled slightly as he returned her grip, his gaze filled with a painful mixture of love and bewilderment. "It's a mistake," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the stifled gasps from the assembled guests. The denial, fragile as a butterfly's wing, felt like a desperate shield against the onslaught of truth. Isabel, her carefully constructed composure crumbling, covered her mouth with a trembling hand. A single tear escaped, tracing a glittering path through her meticulously applied makeup. The flawless facade, meticulously crafted for this very moment, was shattering. Marcus, his usual impassivity replaced by a flicker of remorse in his usually sharp eyes, remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of guilt. Lady Beatrice Thorne, her face a mask of icy disapproval, fixed Eleanor with a look that could curdle milk. The subtle disdain she'd always harbored for the new money Vance family now bloomed into open contempt, a venomous flower in the opulent garden of lies. The implications extended far beyond Eleanor's personal crisis. It threatened the very foundations of the Thorne family's carefully cultivated reputation, their place at the pinnacle of society's gilded pyramid. A low murmur rippled through the stunned guests, a venomous tide threatening to engulf them all. Whispers, sharp as shards of glass, sliced through the air, carrying judgments and speculations that hung heavy with unspoken malice. The champagne flutes, half-filled and forgotten, reflected the shattered hopes and fractured dreams of those present. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of celebration, transformed into a stage for a devastating drama. Eleanor's gaze, sharp and accusatory, darted between Julian's worried face and the twins, their faces etched with a mixture of regret and fear. Their carefully orchestrated plan, their audacious gamble, had backfired spectacularly, unleashing a storm of consequences far beyond their control. The victory, if it could be called that, felt hollow and bitter, leaving behind only a chilling emptiness. The gilded cage, once a symbol of security and belonging, had become a suffocating prison, its bars now cruelly visible, sharp and unforgiving. The meticulously crafted life she'd built, the years of striving for acceptance and belonging, threatened to crumble under the weight of this devastating revelation. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. Crystal shards, scattered from a carelessly knocked-over champagne tower, mirrored the shattering of Eleanor's carefully constructed world. Julian, his face a mask of conflicted emotions, reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, almost apologetic. "Eleanor," he began, his voice barely a whisper lost in the sudden hush of the ballroom. Isabel, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears, flinched at the sound of his voice. Marcus, his jaw still clenched, remained a statue of silent guilt. Their audacious plan, designed to expose a truth, had unleashed a maelstrom of unforeseen consequences. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating. Lady Beatrice, her diamond earrings flashing like icy daggers, fixed Eleanor with a look of pure disdain. This is unacceptable," she hissed, her voice laced with venom, each word dripping with contempt. The years of simmering resentment towards the Vance family, a resentment fueled by social climbing and perceived inferiority, exploded into the open. Eleanor, her eyes blazing with a newfound anger, pulled her hand away from Julian's. The denial that had clung to her like a life raft had finally broken. "It's not a mistake," she declared, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's the truth, and the truth is, I'm not who you think I am." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain and years of suppressed anxieties. The opulent ballroom, once shimmering with celebratory joy, was now draped in a shroud of silence, broken only by the faint clinking of forgotten champagne flutes. The gilded cage, once a symbol of security, had become a prison, its bars cruelly exposed, highlighting the chasm between reality and perception. The scene shifted subtly, the focus moving to Isabel and Marcus, their expressions revealing the dawning realization of the consequences of their actions. Regret warred with a grim determination in their eyes. The gamble they'd taken, driven by a complex mix of justice and personal vendettas, now threatened to consume them both. A single tear traced a path down Isabel's cheek, a stark contrast to the elaborate makeup that had masked her emotions for so long. She looked at Eleanor, a flicker of empathy in her eyes, a silent apology for the pain she had unwittingly caused. The weight of the truth, so carefully crafted and delivered, suddenly felt unbearable. The meticulously planned chaos had spun wildly out of control. The consequences, far-reaching and devastating, were beginning to reveal themselves with chilling clarity. The chandelier's light glinted off the unshed tears clinging to Isabel's lashes. The ballroom, once a symphony of laughter and clinking glasses, was now a mausoleum of stunned silence. Marcus, usually her boisterous counterpart, stood rigidly beside her, his face etched with a remorse that went beyond simple regret. He looked at Eleanor, a woman they'd only ever observed from afar, now caught in the crossfire of their meticulously planned revelation. We didn't mean for it to be like this," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible above the throbbing silence. The words felt hollow even to her own ears. Their carefully constructed plan, driven by a potent cocktail of justice and personal grievances, had backfired spectacularly. Eleanor, her composure a fragile mask, didn't respond immediately. The weight of the truth, the revelation of her stolen identity, pressed down on her like a physical burden. She saw Julian, his face a landscape of confusion and hurt, his eyes mirroring the shattered fragments of their future. The opulent setting, once a symbol of her aspirations, now felt like a gilded cage, mocking her with its opulent emptiness. Lady Beatrice, her face a mask of icy disapproval, stepped forward. The years of carefully cultivated disdain for the Vance family, for Eleanor herself, poured forth in a torrent of venomous whispers, each word a poisoned dart aimed at Eleanor's heart. The accusations stung, yet somehow, a strange sense of liberation began to bloom within Eleanor. Julian finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that cut through the suffocating silence. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, This changes everything." The words hung heavy with the unspoken question. Would it? Would their love withstand the seismic shift in their foundations? The scene shifted. Isabel and Marcus, banished to a secluded corner, observed the unfolding drama with a mixture of guilt and fascination. Their carefully constructed facade, designed to conceal their true motives, crumbled under the weight of the consequences. The weight of their actions bore down upon them. It wasn't just about exposing a truth anymore. It was about facing the aftermath of their deception. The meticulously planned chaos had spun wildly out of control, leaving them trapped in its vortex. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the bitter taste in Eleanor's mouth. Julian's hand, usually warm and reassuring, felt cold and distant on hers. His silence was a chasm, far deeper and more terrifying than Lady Beatrice's venomous whispers. The glittering ballroom, once a symbol of aspiration, felt like a suffocating cage. Isabel watched, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. The remorse etched on Marcus's face mirrored her own, a stark contrast to their initial smugness. Their plan, fueled by years of resentment and a thirst for justice, had spiraled into a maelstrom of unforeseen consequences. "It wasn't supposed to," Isabel began, her voice trembling, but Marcus cut her off with a harsh whisper. "Enough, Isabel. We made our choice." His gaze, usually playful, was now heavy with guilt. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, suffocating their carefully cultivated air of superiority. Eleanor, however, surprised them both. The initial shock, the crushing weight of betrayal, began to give way to a quiet strength. She looked at Julian, his face a mask of confusion and hurt, and saw not only the man she loved, but also the man she had inadvertently judged. "This changes everything," Julian repeated, his voice barely a murmur. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. His touch, so cold moments before, gently brushed her cheek. "But it doesn't have to end everything." His words, tentative yet sincere, pierced through the swirling chaos. The opulent surroundings faded into the background, replaced by the raw honesty in his eyes. The gilded cage, it seemed, had finally sprung open. The champagne flutes, once sparkling symbols of celebration, now felt like shards of glass in Eleanor's trembling hand. The opulent ballroom, a gilded cage moments before, now seemed to press in on her, the weight of the revelation suffocating. Julian's hand, still resting on hers, offered no comfort. Its coldness mirrored the chill that had settled deep within her heart. Isabel and Marcus, observing from a shadowed alcove, exchanged a worried glance. Their meticulously planned disruption had spiraled beyond their control, the consequences far exceeding their expectations. The smug satisfaction they'd felt moments earlier had curdled into a bitter cocktail of regret and fear. The whispers that snaked through the room, once hushed and intrigued, now hissed with judgment and disbelief. I don't understand," Eleanor stammered, her voice barely a whisper above the murmuring crowd. The carefully constructed facade of her perfect life had crumbled, leaving behind a raw vulnerability. Julian squeezed her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Eleanor, we need to talk. Alone." His voice was low, laced with a concern that belied his usual reserved demeanor. The unspoken weight of the DNA results hung heavy between them, a silent accusation that amplified the growing tension. They slipped away unnoticed, the music and laughter of the celebration fading into a distant hum as they sought refuge in a secluded conservatory. The scent of damp earth and exotic blooms offered little solace. The lush greenery, once a symbol of vibrant life, felt suffocating, mirroring the turmoil within Eleanor. It's not possible, Eleanor breathed, her voice choked with disbelief and a dawning horror. The truth, brutally revealed, shattered her carefully curated identity. The family she'd known, loved, and respected were strangers. The wealth, the privilege, everything she had ever believed about herself, all a lie. Julian watched her, his heart aching. He had always perceived her as an outsider, a woman of questionable lineage in the eyes of his family. Now that perception was cruelly confirmed, and the weight of his own prejudices threatened to overwhelm him. Yet, beneath the ingrained biases, a flicker of genuine concern burned bright, battling against the cold judgment of his upbringing. "Eleanor," he began, choosing his words carefully, "whatever the truth is, it doesn't change how I feel about you." His voice was soft, a genuine attempt to break through the wall of disbelief that had risen between them. The sincerity in his tone, however, was fragile, vulnerable. The future, once a clear and certain path, now stretched before them, shrouded in uncertainty. The gilded cage had sprung open, revealing a new, uncertain reality. The conservatory air hung heavy with the scent of lilies and damp earth, a stark contrast to the champagne-soaked opulence of the ballroom. Eleanor stared at her trembling hands, the ornate rings a mocking reminder of the life she thought she knew. The crystal chandelier above cast long, distorted shadows, amplifying her feeling of disorientation. It's not possible," she whispered again, the words catching in her throat. Tears welled, blurring the already hazy image of the lush foliage surrounding them. Julian watched, his usual composure shattered. The carefully constructed mask of indifference he wore in public crumbled, revealing a raw vulnerability that mirrored Eleanor's own. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant but gentle. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a low rumble against the hushed silence of the conservatory. "We need to understand this, together." His words, though intended to comfort, felt like another blow. The weight of his family's expectations, the unspoken judgments she'd always sensed, now felt like a physical presence, pressing down on them both. "My whole life, it was all a lie," she choked out, the words laced with bitter self-discovery. The security she craved, the belonging she desperately sought within Julian's family, vanished like mist in the morning sun. The gilded cage, once a symbol of her aspirations, now felt like a prison. Julian pulled her close, the warmth of his embrace a small comfort in the chilling revelation. "No," he said, his voice firm yet laced with uncertainty. "It doesn't have to be. Whatever the truth is, it doesn't change. It doesn't change what I feel." His words, however, lacked the conviction he desperately wished they held. His own upbringing, the ingrained biases he'd struggled to ignore, clawed at him, threatening to pull him away from her. Isabel and Marcus, unseen from their shadowed alcove, watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of apprehension and a lingering, unsettling sense of guilt. Their actions, intended to expose a truth, had unleashed a torrent of unforeseen consequences. The whispered congratulations they'd exchanged moments before were now replaced by a heavy silence, their faces etched with the weight of their actions. The carefully planned disruption had transformed into a maelstrom, swallowing them whole. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of their audacious plan, now felt like a dangerous game they had no control over. The champagne flutes, once sparkling symbols of celebration, now felt like shards of glass in Eleanor's trembling hand. The opulent ballroom, a gilded cage only moments before, now suffocated her. The scent of lilies, previously sweet, now cloying, mirrored the sickening sweetness of the lie she'd been living. Julian's hand, warm over hers, offered little comfort. Its gentleness felt almost foreign. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed murmurs of the increasingly disturbed guests. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, crushing the carefully constructed facade of her perfect life. Julian's gaze, usually sharp and calculating, was clouded with confusion. He squeezed her hand, his touch conveying a mixture of concern and something akin to fear. "We'll figure this out," he murmured, the assurance lacking conviction. The unspoken truth hung heavy between them. His family's disapproval, their ingrained prejudices about social standing, threatened to unravel everything. Isabel and Marcus, observing from the shadows of a nearby archway, exchanged a look. Their carefully orchestrated plan had spiraled far beyond their control. The thrill of exposure had curdled into a bitter taste of regret. Marcus's jaw was tight, his usual playful demeanor replaced by a grim seriousness. Isabel's eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were now filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. They had exposed a truth, but at what cost? The scene shifted to Eleanor's parents, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and something resembling relief. The carefully maintained facade of their perfect family portrait was cracking, revealing years of unspoken anxieties and carefully concealed secrets. Their carefully constructed smiles were gone. In their eyes, Eleanor saw years of untold stories, fears she had only now begun to truly understand. A single tear escaped Eleanor's eye, tracing a path through the meticulously applied makeup. The perfect bride, the perfect daughter, the perfect lie, all crumbling before her eyes. The glittering ballroom, with its cascading chandeliers and opulent decor, mocked her newfound vulnerability. The joyous music, once a celebratory soundtrack to her supposed happily ever after, now felt like a cruel parody. "This changes everything," Julian finally said, his voice tight with a mixture of confusion and fear. He wasn't sure what he was more afraid of, losing Eleanor or facing his family's wrath. His carefully constructed world had been shattered, and he was just beginning to understand how deeply the truth would affect him. The weight of the revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the once celebratory atmosphere dissolved into a maelstrom of disbelief and uncertainty. The gilded cage had sprung open, unleashing a torrent of emotions that threatened to swallow them all. The twins, their mission accomplished, now faced the daunting task of confronting the consequences of their actions, a task far more challenging than they had ever anticipated. The silence following Julian's words was deafening, broken only by the clinking of abandoned champagne glasses. Crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows across the ballroom floor, transforming the opulent space into a shadowy labyrinth of anxieties. Eleanor felt a tremor run through her, not just from the cold that had inexplicably settled in the room, but from a deeper, primal fear. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now felt suffocating, a heavy perfume clinging to the unspoken truths swirling in the air. Eleanor began, her voice catching. She looked at Julian, his face etched with a mixture of confusion and fear, a vulnerability she'd never seen before. The perfect, composed Julian Thorne, a man sculpted from privilege and expectation, was cracking. Isabel and Marcus, their faces hidden in the shadows of a nearby archway, watched, their own emotions a tangled knot of apprehension and grim satisfaction. Their plan, so meticulously crafted, had unleashed a chaos that threatened to engulf them all. Regret, sharp and bitter, tasted like ash in Marcus's mouth. He saw Isabel's shoulders slump, the fight draining from her usually vibrant posture. The weight of their actions was crushing them. From the periphery, Eleanor's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vance, exchanged a look fraught with a chilling mixture of relief and something akin to guilt. Their faces, usually masks of polished composure, were cracked, revealing the fragility beneath the veneer of wealth. The years of carefully constructed lies, the anxieties that fueled their opulent facade, were now laid bare. Eleanor saw it in her mother's trembling hands, the way her father nervously adjusted his cufflinks, a small, almost imperceptible twitch betraying his unease. This isn't what I wanted," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible even to Marcus. The carefully constructed facade of their rebellion had crumbled. The truth, raw and unforgiving, had exposed not just Eleanor's secret, but their own vulnerabilities as well. A tear escaped Eleanor's eye, a single, hot drop tracing a path down her cheek. A stark contrast to the flawless makeup and the extravagant setting. The meticulously crafted image of the perfect bride, the perfect daughter, shattered. The joyous music, once a celebratory soundtrack to her life, now felt like a cruel mockery of her reality. The gilded cage had indeed sprung open, releasing not just a torrent of emotions, but the cold, harsh reality of her life's foundation. The truth, like a chilling wind, swept through the ballroom, leaving behind a wreckage of shattered dreams and exposed vulnerabilities. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations, crackled with tension. Eleanor's trembling hand reached for her glass of champagne, the crystal cold against her skin. It offered no solace. Julian's confession hung heavy, a lead weight in the opulent ballroom. His words, I didn't know, echoed in the stunned silence. The phrase felt inadequate, a flimsy shield against the storm brewing within Eleanor. Isabel and Marcus, still hidden in the shadows, exchanged a look. Regret, raw and bitter, painted itself across Marcus's face, mirroring the sudden slump of Isabel's shoulders. Their meticulously planned rebellion had backfired, unleashing a torrent of consequences they hadn't foreseen. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, heavier than any societal expectation. Mrs. Vance, her carefully maintained composure crumbling, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The tremor in her hand, barely perceptible, betrayed the years of carefully constructed lies. Mr. Vance, his usually impeccable grooming slightly askew, nervously adjusted his cufflinks, the small, repetitive gesture a stark contrast to his normally assured demeanor. Their perfect facade, the very foundation of their opulent life, had fractured. Eleanor felt a tear escape, tracing a hot path down her cheek, staining the flawless makeup. The carefully constructed image of the perfect bride, the daughter they so desperately wanted her to be, shattered into a million pieces. The celebratory music, a cruel mockery of her reality, faded into a dull hum. The glittering ballroom, once a symbol of her aspirations, transformed into a gilded cage, its bars of wealth and expectation closing in. This isn't right, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely a breath. The carefully composed facade she'd maintained for so long, the smile she'd plastered on her face through years of insecurity, finally crumbled. She looked at Julian, his face a canvas of confusion, fear, and a vulnerability she'd never witnessed before. The perfect Julian, the man sculpted from privilege and expectation, was cracking. The meticulously crafted illusion of their perfect union was dissolving, revealing a chasm of doubt and uncertainty. The truth, raw and unforgiving, lay exposed, not just in Eleanor's parentage, but in the vulnerabilities of everyone present. The shimmering ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and lavish decorations, felt suddenly cold, a stark reminder of the fragility of their lives. The weight of revelation, heavy and suffocating, settled upon them all. The champagne, once celebratory, now tasted like ash in Eleanor's mouth. The crystal glass felt slick with unshed tears. Julian's whispered apology, lost in the cavernous ballroom, felt as hollow as the promises he'd made. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, unsure. Eleanor flinched, pulling away. The warmth of his touch, once a source of comfort, now felt like a brand. Isabel and Marcus emerged from the shadows, their faces etched with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. The carefully crafted plan, designed to expose a truth, had unleashed a chaos far beyond their control. Marcus's gaze fell upon Mrs. Vance, whose composure had completely crumbled. The elaborate updo had loosened, strands of silver escaping, mirroring the unraveling of her carefully constructed life. Eleanor, Isabel began, her voice trembling. We didn't mean for this. Eleanor's gaze swept across the room, her eyes lingering on the shocked faces of the guests. The opulent decor, the shimmering chandeliers, the plush velvet seating, the priceless artwork now seemed grotesque, a mocking symbol of the wealth she'd unknowingly inherited through deceit. The music, once a joyous soundtrack, now felt like a funeral dirge. Mr. Vance, his usually pristine appearance disheveled, cleared his throat, the sound oddly brittle. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of the revelation. His carefully maintained facade, like a thin veneer of paint, had cracked, revealing the raw, fractured reality beneath. The air vibrated with unspoken accusations, the silence punctuated only by the occasional stifled sob. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The meticulously planned wedding, the culmination of her dreams, had become a battlefield of shattered illusions. The weight of the truth, heavy and suffocating, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. The perfect life she'd envisioned, the life she'd so desperately craved, lay in ruins. Her carefully constructed self, built on a foundation of lies, had begun to disintegrate. The glittering cage, once a symbol of her aspirations, had become a prison. The truth, she realized, was far more complicated, far more devastating than she could have ever imagined. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of her perfect wedding, she felt utterly, heartbreakingly alone. The ballroom's glittering facade couldn't mask the chill that had settled over the wedding. Crystal chandeliers seemed to weep icy tears onto the plush velvet chairs, now stained with the residue of spilled champagne and unspoken accusations. Eleanor, her breath misting in the frigid air, felt the ornate gold frame of a nearby painting press into her back. A cold, unforgiving embrace. This isn't possible," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, a fragile thread against the storm raging within her. Her gaze, once bright with anticipation, now held a desolate emptiness. Julian, his usual charm replaced by a stunned bewilderment, reached for her hand again, his touch tentative, apologetic. "Eleanor, please, let me," she recoiled, the sharp sting of betrayal overriding any flicker of remaining affection. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice laced with a bitterness she hadn't known she possessed. The carefully constructed image of the perfect bride lay shattered, leaving behind only a raw vulnerability. Isabel, her face pale under the harsh glare of the chandeliers, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We had no idea it would unravel like this. We only wanted you to know the truth." Her eyes, brimming with unshed tears, mirrored the pain reflected in Eleanor's own. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, remained silent, his gaze fixed on Mr. Vance, whose usually impeccable composure had crumbled, revealing a man consumed by fear and desperation. The meticulously crafted facade of wealth and privilege was peeling away, revealing cracks of deceit and insecurity. Mrs. Vance, her silver hair escaping its elegant updo, let out a choked sob. The weight of the revelation seemed to crush her, her carefully cultivated strength dissolving into a heartbreaking display of vulnerability. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and the bitter tang of shattered dreams. Eleanor felt a strange detachment, as if watching her own life unfold as a tragic play. The glittering cage, once a symbol of aspiration, had become a gilded prison, its bars forged from lies and deceit. The truth, she realized, was far more complex, far more devastating than any fairy tale ending. And in this moment of stark reality, amidst the wreckage of her perfect wedding, the weight of her newfound reality threatened to consume her. The hushed whispers, like a venomous swarm, buzzed around Eleanor. The champagne flutes, moments before brimming with celebratory bubbles, now stood abandoned, their contents mirroring the shattered fragments of her life. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of fairy tale perfection, felt suffocating, its gilded cage bars tightening around her. Each glittering chandelier seemed to mock her with its cold, unwavering light, illuminating the stark reality of her shattered world. Julian, his face etched with a confusion that bordered on panic, reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. "Eleanor," he began, his voice barely a breath against the mounting tension. She flinched, pulling away. The warmth she'd craved from him, the solace she'd desperately sought, was now replaced by a chilling emptiness. "Don't," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime's betrayal. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect love story crumbled, replaced by a gaping chasm of uncertainty. Isabel watched, her own eyes brimming with a complex mixture of remorse and apprehension. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, a heavy cloak of guilt. "We didn't want to hurt you," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the rising murmur of the shocked guests. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, remained silent, his gaze fixed on Mr. Vance, whose usually impeccable composure had dissolved into a mask of horrified disbelief. His carefully cultivated demeanor, built on a lifetime of carefully constructed lies, had shattered like fragile glass. Mrs. Vance, her perfectly coiffed silver hair escaping its elegant updo, wept silently, her body shaking with the force of her suppressed grief. The meticulously crafted world they'd built, a world of privilege and illusion, was collapsing around them, revealing the ugly truth buried beneath its gilded surface. Eleanor felt a profound sense of detachment, as if observing a tragic play unfolding before her eyes. Remorse. Their carefully laid plan had shattered, unleashing a cascade of devastation far beyond their control. Mrs. Vance's meticulously crafted composure crumbled. Her carefully applied makeup was smudged, mirroring the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. She clung to her husband, her sobs a ragged counterpoint to the hushed whispers filling the room. Mr. Vance, his face ashen, stared at his wife, a mixture of anger, regret, and fear swirling in his usually controlled eyes. Their perfect world, meticulously built on lies and privilege, lay in ruins. The low murmur of the guests intensified, a wave of disbelief and whispered accusations washing over the room. The once opulent ballroom felt claustrophobic, the gilded cage transforming into a suffocating prison. Eleanor, feeling exposed and vulnerable, stumbled back, her gaze sweeping across the shocked faces, each one a silent judgment, a stark reminder of the years spent pretending, striving for acceptance, building a persona that had now crumbled. "Who am I?" she breathed, the question lost in the silence, yet echoing in the vast, opulent emptiness. The answer, she knew, wouldn't be found in a DNA test, but within herself, in the painful, arduous process of rebuilding her life from the ashes of her shattered identity. The journey ahead felt daunting, filled with uncertainty and pain. But amidst the wreckage, a spark of defiance ignited a fierce determination to forge her own path, to claim an identity unburdened by the expectations of others. The weight of her past felt heavy, yet a fragile hope flickered, promising a future defined not by her birthright but by her own strength. The champagne flutes, once brimming with celebratory bubbles, now felt heavy in trembling hands. Crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows as the room's hushed whispers intensified. Eleanor, her carefully constructed composure shattered, stumbled towards a gilded chair, the ornate carvings digging into her skin. The weight of the truth pressed down. The opulent ballroom, moments ago a sanctuary of joy, now felt like a suffocating cage. Julian watched her, his own carefully maintained facade crumbling. The charming veneer he presented to the world cracked, revealing a man grappling with disbelief and a dawning understanding of his own prejudices. He wanted to reach her, to offer comfort, but the chasm between them felt unbridgeable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, raw with emotion. "Eleanor," he began, the name sounding foreign even to his own ears. He trailed off, unsure of what words could possibly mend the shattered reality. Isabel and Marcus exchanged a look, the mischievous glint in their eyes replaced by a heavy remorse. The thrill of exposing the truth had vanished, replaced by the stark reality of the devastation they'd unleashed. Isabel's gaze softened as she saw Eleanor's pain. We didn't mean for this to happen," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. the words lost in the growing cacophony of whispered accusations. Mrs. Vance, her meticulously applied makeup now smeared, clung to her husband, her sobs echoing the shattering of their meticulously constructed world. Mr. Vance, his face ashen, remained frozen, his usual controlled demeanor replaced by a paralysis of fear and regret. The carefully cultivated image of their perfect family, built on lies and privilege, lay in ruins around them. Their silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to the growing uproar of the guests. A movement caught Eleanor's eye. Her father, his face a mask of controlled fury, stood rigid, his eyes darting between her and his trembling wife. The years of carefully maintained appearances, the unspoken resentments, the carefully constructed web of lies, all came crashing down. His silence, his rigid stance, spoke of a deeper fracture, a conflict that transcended the recent revelations. The weight of his unspoken anger hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that mirrored the turmoil within Eleanor's own heart. The gilded cage had collapsed, revealing the fractured truth beneath. The journey to rebuild, to claim her own identity, would be long and arduous, a path filled with uncertainty and pain. But in the heart of the wreckage, a flicker of defiance, a fierce determination began to bloom. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations, crackled with tension. Eleanor, her breath hitching in ragged gasps, felt the gilded chair dig into her spine, a physical manifestation of the crushing weight of revelation. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the opulent ballroom into a shimmering kaleidoscope of guilt and betrayal. Julian, his face ashen, reached out a hand, then hesitated, the gesture caught midair like a trapped bird. The unspoken words hung heavy between them, a chasm wider than any societal divide. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a fragile thing against the rising murmur of the shocked guests. His eyes, usually sparkling with an easy charm, were now clouded with confusion and a nascent understanding of his own ingrained prejudices. The carefully constructed image of their perfect union shattered before him, replaced by a raw, unsettling reality. Isabel, her initial triumph replaced by a wave of remorse, watched Eleanor with a mixture of pity and guilt. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado replaced by a quiet unease. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, the exhilaration of their plan now a bitter aftertaste. Mrs. Vance, her carefully composed facade crumbling, clutched her husband's arm, her sobs a counterpoint to the hushed whispers swirling around them. Mr. Vance, his face a mask of controlled fury barely concealing his fear, remained rigid, his eyes darting between his wife and Eleanor, a silent storm brewing within him. The years of unspoken resentments, the carefully constructed lies, all lay exposed, raw and bleeding in the harsh light of truth. The silence between them was deafening, a testament to the deep-seated fracture within their seemingly perfect family. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Whispers turned to accusations, the once celebratory atmosphere replaced by a chilling undercurrent of judgment and speculation. The champagne flutes, abandoned halfway to lips, reflected the fractured images of a shattered world. The crystal chandeliers, once symbols of glittering prosperity, now seemed to mock the exposed vulnerabilities of the assembled guests. The gilded cage had indeed collapsed, revealing not just the truth about Eleanor's parentage, but the fragility of the world they had inhabited. The journey towards healing and self-discovery had begun, a path strewn with the debris of shattered dreams. The hushed whispers intensified, a low hum vibrating through the opulent ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows, making the already shocked guests seem spectral. Eleanor, her face streaked with tears, felt utterly exposed. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, suffocating her. Julian's hand, still outstretched, trembled slightly. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Could their love withstand this seismic shift? "Eleanor," he repeated, his voice barely audible above the rising murmur. He took a tentative step towards her, his eyes mirroring the turmoil within. He saw not just the woman he thought he knew, but a vulnerable girl stripped bare by the cruel hand of fate. His own carefully constructed world, built on privilege and assumptions, crumbled before him. Isabel, the initial thrill of victory fading, felt a wave of guilt wash over her. The sight of Eleanor's despair, the raw pain etched on her face, shattered her triumphant self-satisfaction. She'd intended to expose a lie, but she'd inadvertently caused a maelstrom of destruction. Marcus, ever the strategist, felt a prickle of unease. He'd anticipated chaos, but the sheer intensity of the emotional fallout caught him off guard. His pragmatic calculations were inadequate in the face of raw human emotion. The weight of their actions, the unintended consequences, settled upon him like a physical burden. Mrs. Vance's controlled composure finally fractured. She collapsed into her husband's arms, her sobs a desperate release of years of suppressed anxieties and carefully guarded secrets. Mr. Vance, his face a mask of controlled fury, remained outwardly rigid, but his tightly clenched fists betrayed his inner turmoil. The carefully cultivated image of their perfect family lay shattered, exposing a landscape of hidden resentments and carefully constructed lies. A low gasp rippled through the crowd as a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Eleanor. A murmur of recognition spread through the room. This was Eleanor's biological mother, a woman shunned by high society years ago for a love that defied convention. Her presence, a silent affirmation of Eleanor's true heritage, amplified the gravity of the situation. The glittering facade of the wedding, the meticulously planned celebration, had been reduced to rubble, revealing a truth far more profound and devastating than anyone could have foreseen. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, anticipation for the next act. The gilded cage had fallen, revealing not just a hidden truth, but the vulnerable hearts within. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations, crackled with a volatile energy. Eleanor, a fragile porcelain doll shattered, stared at her hands, the diamond engagement ring a cruel mockery. Julian's touch, once comforting, now felt like a brand. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words hung in the air, a pathetic plea lost in the maelstrom of shocked silence. Isabel watched, her initial triumph replaced by a chilling unease. The devastation on Eleanor's face was far more potent than any victory. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, felt a cold dread creeping into his carefully constructed plans. This wasn't the calculated chaos they'd anticipated. This was something far more raw, far more real. Mrs. Vance, her carefully sculpted composure finally cracking, let out a strangled sob. Mr. Vance, his face a mask of controlled rage, clutched her hand, his knuckles bone white. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of their flawless success, now felt like a prison, its gilded cage trapping them in a nightmare of their own making. Eleanor's biological mother, a woman etched with the wisdom of unspoken sorrows, stepped forward. Her eyes, mirroring Eleanor's, held a quiet strength that belied the years of rejection she'd endured. A wave of murmurs rippled through the stunned guests as she approached Eleanor, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "Eleanor," she said softly, her voice a balm to the wounded soul, "I know this is a lot, but it is not an ending, but a beginning." Her voice carried a quiet strength that belied the years of rejection she had endured. A tear traced a path down her cheek, mirroring the sorrow, but also the silent promise of acceptance and love. The weight of years of secrets and lies began to lift, replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. The chaos began to slow, settling into a hushed anticipation of what would follow. The future remained uncertain, yet in the quiet strength of a mother's love and the painful revelation of truth, a sliver of hope emerged from the wreckage. The champagne flutes, moments before brimming with celebratory bubbles, now sat abandoned, mirroring the shattered hopes of the guests. Crystal chandeliers seemed to weep, their light reflecting in the stunned, tear-streaked faces. Eleanor, pale and trembling, retreated to a secluded corner, the opulent tapestry cold against her back. The weight of the revelation, not just the news of her parentage, but the unraveling of her entire life pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. Julian, his face etched with a bewilderment that bordered on horror, watched her from across the room. The carefully constructed image of his perfect bride, the woman who represented his ascension in the social hierarchy, lay in ruins. His internal conflict raged. Societal expectations clashed violently with a nascent understanding of genuine love. He wanted to approach her, to offer comfort, but the fear of the unknown, the fear of what this meant for his future, paralyzed him. Isabel, her initial satisfaction replaced by a gnawing unease, observed the unfolding drama with a mixture of guilt and fascination. The stark reality of their actions, the raw emotional pain they had inflicted, hit her harder than anticipated. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, tried to maintain control, but his usually unwavering confidence wavered under the weight of the unexpected consequences. He hadn't anticipated this level of emotional devastation. Mrs. Vance, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking, wept openly, the sound swallowed by the hushed whispers of the shocked onlookers. Mr. Vance, his face a mask of furious denial, stood rigidly beside her, his grip on her hand tightening until his knuckles shone white. The elegant ballroom, a testament to their wealth and power, felt suddenly claustrophobic, suffocating them in the aftermath of their meticulously crafted illusion. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and the bitter tang of betrayal, hung heavy. The silence, broken only by the occasional sob, was a stark contrast to the joyous cacophony that had reigned just hours before. The gilded cage had sprung a leak, and the carefully constructed world within was beginning to flood. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Eleanor, the opulent ballroom suddenly a suffocating cage. She could taste the metallic tang of fear, feel the icy grip of panic constricting her chest. Julian's stunned silence felt like a physical blow. His carefully constructed composure, his carefully chosen words, were shattered fragments at her feet. "Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed whispers swirling around them. "Say something." He opened his mouth, closed it, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The silence stretched, an agonizing chasm between them. The lilies, their fragrance once a symbol of purity and joy, now felt cloying, suffocating. Isabel approached cautiously, her initial triumphant satisfaction replaced by a hesitant sympathy. "Eleanor," she began, her voice low. Eleanor cut her off, her eyes blazing. Don't pretend you didn't orchestrate this." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Marcus stepped forward, his usually controlled demeanor frayed at the edges. "It wasn't about malice, Eleanor. It was about—" He faltered, searching for the right words, his gaze drifting to the rigid figures of Mr. and Mrs. Vance. Their faces, once masks of wealth and power, were now contorted with a mixture of fury and devastation. The confrontation ignited a firestorm. Mrs. Vance, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling, launched into a tirade, accusations flying like shards of glass. Her voice, shrill and laced with venom, pierced the stunned silence. Mr. Vance, his grip on his wife's arm tightening, remained ominously silent, his eyes filled with a dark, simmering rage. Eleanor, her heart a shattered mirror reflecting her fractured identity, felt the sting of their rejection, the icy chill of betrayal. The opulent setting, once a symbol of belonging, now mocked her with its ostentatious display of wealth and privilege, a wealth she never truly possessed, a privilege she now realized was built on a lie. The glittering chandeliers seemed to mock her with their cold, unfeeling light. The lavish decor, once a source of comfort, now felt alien, cold, and starkly impersonal. She was adrift, a small boat tossed on a tumultuous sea of anger, fear, and uncertainty. The champagne flutes, abandoned and forgotten, were a perfect symbol of her own shattered dreams. The music, once a celebration of love and happiness, now echoed the hollow emptiness in her soul. The weight of this revelation, this sudden upending of her life, threatened to crush her. The truth, it seemed, was a bitter pill to swallow, leaving an acrid taste of betrayal and heartbreak in its wake. The opulent ballroom, once shimmering with celebratory light, now felt cold and cavernous. Eleanor, her breath catching in ragged gasps, stared at the swirling chaos. The scent of lilies, once sweet, now clung to the air like a suffocating shroud. Julian, his face ashen, remained frozen, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Isabel, her initial triumph replaced by a hesitant unease, shifted from foot to foot. Marcus, usually composed, looked utterly lost, his gaze darting between Eleanor and the Vances, whose faces were masks of furious denial. "It wasn't about hurting you," Marcus finally stammered, his voice barely a whisper. We wanted the truth to be known." Eleanor's laughter was brittle, devoid of humor. "The truth? You call this truth? You shattered everything. My life, my family, everything I thought I knew." Tears streamed down her face, hot and bitter. She swiped at them angrily, her voice cracking. "You think a simple sorry will fix this?" Mrs. Vance, her meticulously crafted composure finally fracturing, shrieked, "He's not my son. He's a fraud." Her voice, sharp and accusatory, cut through the stunned silence. Mr. Vance, his jaw clenched tight, remained silent, his eyes cold and unforgiving. His usual carefully controlled demeanor was gone, replaced by a raw, simmering anger. Eleanor felt a chilling emptiness bloom within her, a void where her carefully constructed life once stood. The glittering chandeliers seemed to mock her with their cold indifference. The sheer opulence of the venue felt alien, a cruel reminder of the life that was dissolving around her like melting ice. Julian finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Eleanor?" He reached out a trembling hand, but stopped short, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and pain. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Could their love survive this? Could he accept a woman whose very identity had been a lie? His internal struggle was palpable, a silent battle waged between his heart and the suffocating expectations of his world. Isabel stepped forward again, her voice laced with genuine regret. "We didn't anticipate this. The extent of the damage." Her eyes, usually bright and sharp, were clouded with remorse. The initial thrill of their revelation had curdled into a bitter taste of guilt. The weight of the situation pressed down on everyone. The once joyous celebration had descended into a maelstrom of accusations, recriminations, and raw, exposed emotions. The champagne flutes, scattered and forgotten, mirrored the shattered fragments of Eleanor's life. The music, once vibrant, now felt like a mocking soundtrack to her unraveling. The truth, it seemed, was a devastating hurricane, tearing apart the lives of everyone caught in its path. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of dreams, had become a battlefield, where the fight was not for love and happiness, but for survival and self-discovery. The opulent ballroom, still echoing with the fragments of shattered glass, felt colder now, the celebratory warmth replaced by a chilling silence. Eleanor, huddled on a plush velvet chaise lounge, felt the silk biting into her skin, a stark contrast to the icy numbness spreading through her veins. Julian knelt beside her, his hand hovering over hers, but he didn't touch. The unspoken chasm between them yawned wider with each passing second. I don't understand," Julian whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. He looked utterly lost, the carefully constructed facade of the charming, controlled Julian Thorne crumbling before Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the scattered champagne flutes, their delicate crystal mirroring the fragility of her own existence. "Understand what, Julian? That the woman you were about to marry was a fraud? That everything I told you was a carefully constructed lie?" Her voice, though laced with bitterness, was barely a whisper. Isabel and Marcus stood near the doorway, observing the scene with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. Isabel's usually vibrant energy was subdued, replaced by a quiet remorse. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, wore a look of deep regret, his shoulders slumped with the weight of their actions. The twins' initial triumph had long since evaporated, replaced by a sobering awareness of the consequences. Mrs. Vance, her face a mask of simmering rage, paced like a caged lioness, her elegant gown a mere backdrop to her uncontrolled fury. Mr. Vance, still rigid with barely contained anger, stood silently beside her, his usually impassive features etched with sharp lines of disapproval. The air crackled with their unspoken accusations, a silent battleground of resentment and denial. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional stifled sob from Eleanor. The lilies, their once sweet fragrance now cloying and suffocating, seemed to mock her with their artificial beauty. The glittering chandeliers, symbols of wealth and extravagance, felt like cruel reminders of the life she'd built on a foundation of lies. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Marcus finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. His words hung in the air, a fragile plea lost in the vastness of Eleanor's despair. Eleanor looked up, her eyes red and swollen. It wasn't supposed to be like anything, she choked out, the words a raw expression of her inner turmoil. The truth, once a liberating revelation, had morphed into a devastating weapon, shattering everything she held dear. The opulent setting, once a symbol of her dreams, had become a stark reminder of her shattered reality. The weight of her secret, once a heavy burden, now felt like a crushing weight, threatening to suffocate her. The future, once bright with promise, now lay shrouded in uncertainty. The wedding, a celebration of love, had become a battlefield of truth, and Eleanor was left to pick up the pieces. The air hung thick with unspoken accusations, the scent of lilies battling the metallic tang of blood. A tiny cut on Eleanor's hand, unnoticed until now, bled slowly onto the pristine white tablecloth. Julian, his face a mask of bewildered grief, reached for her, his touch hesitant, as if afraid of shattering something already broken. His eyes, usually so bright with controlled amusement, were dull with a pain that mirrored her own. "It wasn't a deliberate betrayal," Isabel finally said, her voice trembling, breaking the suffocating silence. Her gaze, usually so sharp, was now clouded with remorse. She took a step closer, her elegant dress a stark contrast to the chaos around her. Marcus remained silent, his jaw clenched, the weight of their actions pressing heavily upon him. He watched Eleanor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, her usually impeccable composure shattered. The opulence of the ballroom, the shimmering crystal, the plush velvet, seemed to mock her devastation. Mrs. Vance, her face a mask of cold fury, interrupted the fragile peace. "Deliberate or not, the damage is done. My daughter's life, our family's reputation." Her voice trailed off, choked with bitter resentment. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken years. Eleanor looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Reputation," she whispered, her voice raw with pain. "What about my life? The life I thought I knew, the family I thought I had." Her voice broke, the carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of her emotional wreckage. The fragile hope that had flickered earlier was extinguished. Julian, ever the pragmatist, looked from Eleanor's ravaged face to the twins, his gaze heavy with a dawning realization. The charming facade was gone, replaced by a raw, agonizing self-awareness. He moved closer to Eleanor, his touch gentler this time, a tentative attempt to bridge the chasm between them. His actions spoke volumes about a man confronting his own deep-seated prejudices. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of dreams, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping Eleanor in a web of lies and broken promises. The night had been irrevocably altered. The joyous celebration turned to a heart-wrenching testament to the unpredictable nature of truth. The future remained uncertain, shrouded in the shadows of revelation. But in the midst of the wreckage, a glimmer of something new began to form. A fragile hope for resilience, a yearning for acceptance, and a tenacious fight for self-discovery. The opulent ballroom, now a battlefield of shattered illusions, felt colder than the winter night pressing against its towering windows. Eleanor, her face pale and drawn, retreated to a secluded alcove, the plush velvet offering little comfort. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, suffocating. Julian followed, his usual effortless charm replaced by a hesitant vulnerability. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering near hers, then retreating, pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket woven from betrayal and shattered illusions. Julian found her there, a hesitant figure in the vast emptiness. He approached slowly, his usual confident swagger replaced by a hesitant gait. The apology trembled on his lips, unspoken. He knelt beside her, his touch tentative, as if afraid to break her. "Eleanor," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to say." Eleanor didn't look at him. The tears she'd fought back all night threatened to spill over. The opulent surroundings, once symbols of a fairy tale romance, now mocked her with their cold indifference. "You didn't know," she said, her voice raspy with unshed tears. "But you should have." "I was blind," Julian admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Blind to my own prejudices, my own assumptions. I let societal expectations dictate my judgment." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle, respectful. She didn't pull away. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the distant hallway. The silence was heavy, laden with unspoken words, with the ghosts of what might have been. But within the silence, a shift occurred, a subtle change in the atmosphere. Isabel and Marcus appeared at the doorway, observing them from a distance. Their faces, once hardened with a sense of righteous anger, now wore expressions of hesitant hope. They saw the vulnerability in Julian's posture, the quiet desperation in Eleanor's slumped shoulders. Their own actions loomed large in the quiet, casting a long shadow of regret. Eleanor finally looked at Julian, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. The pain remained, a raw wound that wouldn't heal overnight, but something else stirred within her. A fragile ember of forgiveness, of understanding. The future remained uncertain, a vast and unknown landscape. But in the shared silence of the ravaged ballroom, a tentative step toward healing had been taken. The dawn, breaking through the tall windows, cast a hopeful glow upon the ruins of their shattered dreams, promising a new day, and perhaps a new beginning. The stale air hung thick with the scent of regret, a bitter counterpoint to the lingering sweetness of the wedding cake. Sunlight, weak and watery, filtered through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the deserted ballroom. Eleanor, still in her gown, felt its weight, a physical manifestation of her shattered dreams. The opulent setting, once a symbol of fairy tale promise, now mocked her with its cold indifference. Julian, his usual assurance replaced by a hesitant vulnerability, sat beside her. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative, mirroring the fragile hope in his eyes. "Eleanor," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand now. I was so blinded by everything. By my supposed lack of pedigree?" She finished, her voice raspy, yet surprisingly strong. The tears she'd fought back all night remained unshed, a dam holding back a torrent of pain. She looked at him, her gaze steady despite the turmoil within. "You judged me before you even knew me." He nodded, his gaze fixed on their intertwined hands. The silence that followed stretched, thick with unspoken words, the weight of their fractured reality pressing down on them. The only sound was the faint ticking of a distant clock, each tick a stark reminder of time slipping away. Isabel and Marcus stood in the doorway, observing them with a mixture of guilt and hesitant hope. The righteous anger that had fueled their actions had dissipated, replaced by a sobering awareness of the consequences. Their earlier certainty had crumbled under the weight of the emotional wreckage they'd helped create. Isabel finally spoke, her voice soft. We didn't intend for things to turn out this way." Her eyes, once sharp and accusatory, now held a flicker of remorse. Marcus nodded in agreement, his usual brash demeanor subdued. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he mumbled. his gaze fixed on the floor. Exposing the truth, but we didn't consider the collateral damage. Eleanor looked at them, her heart a battlefield of anger, hurt, and a nascent understanding. The pain remained, sharp and raw, but a sliver of forgiveness pierced through the darkness. The weight of their deception still lingered, but she saw, in their contrite expressions, a genuine regret that transcended self-preservation. A fragile hope flickered within her, as weak as the pale sunlight filtering through the ballroom windows. Perhaps, amidst the ruins of her shattered expectations, a new beginning could emerge, not from fairy tale perfection, but from a hard-earned understanding. The future remained uncertain, yet in that quiet, desolate ballroom, a tentative step towards healing had been made. The heavy oak door creaked shut behind Isabel and Marcus, leaving Eleanor and Julian alone in the cavernous ballroom. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. Dust motes, illuminated by the weak afternoon sun, swirled in the stillness. Eleanor traced the intricate pattern of the tablecloth, the damask cool against her fingertips, a stark contrast to the burning shame she felt. Julian reached for her hand again, his touch hesitant, unsure. I don't know what to say, Eleanor." His voice, usually so assured, was a fragile whisper. The weight of his unspoken words hung heavy between them. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze steady despite the turmoil within. The tears threatening to spill were a testament to the years of carefully constructed lies, a life built on a foundation of deceit. "Say you understand," she breathed, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock. "Say you understand that you judged me before you even knew me." He nodded slowly, his eyes mirroring her pain. "I was so caught up in appearances, in expectations," he confessed, his voice thick with regret. "I never truly saw you." A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the relentless ticking of the clock. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of joy and promise, now felt like a gilded cage, confining them in their shared sorrow. The scent of lilies, once intoxicating, now felt cloying, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Eleanor stood, her movements slow and deliberate. The weight of her wedding gown felt oppressive, a physical manifestation of the shattered dreams that lay scattered around them like broken glass. She walked to the window, gazing out at the city sprawling below. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that failed to touch the bleakness in her heart. "What now?" she murmured, her voice barely a whisper lost in the vast emptiness of the room. The question hung in the air, unanswered, a testament to the uncertainty that lay ahead. The path forward was unclear, a tangled maze of shattered trust and uncertain futures. But in the shared silence, a fragile hope began to bloom, a hope that perhaps, from the ashes of this devastation, something stronger, truer could rise. The journey would be arduous, but for the first time, they faced it together. The ballroom, now deserted save for them, felt vast and echoing. Moonlight, filtering through the tall windows, cast long, dramatic shadows across the polished floor. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now clung to the air like a shroud. Eleanor, still in her wedding gown, felt its weight, a physical manifestation of the shattered promises. Julian, his usually impeccable composure frayed, sat heavily in a gilded chair, his face etched with remorse. "I should have seen it," he finally said, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Your unhappiness. I was so blinded by—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the societal pressures that had clouded his judgment. Eleanor didn't interrupt. She understood. She'd lived her life carefully constructed around the expectations of others, a gilded cage of her own making. The cool marble of the windowsill felt comforting against her cheek as she looked out at the sleeping city. "It wasn't just you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic hum of the city below. "I allowed it. I built this facade." He rose and approached her cautiously, his movements hesitant, unsure. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle, apologetic. Can we try to fix this? The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared pain, the burden of unspoken truths. The answer wasn't a simple yes or no. It was a labyrinth of hurt, of betrayal, of ingrained societal biases that had to be unraveled, thread by painful thread. The moonlight glinted off the diamond on her finger, a stark reminder of the promises broken, the life unlived. I don't know, Eleanor admitted, her voice cracking. The tears finally flowed, a torrent of pent-up emotion. I don't know if we can. Julian sat beside her, his arm awkwardly around her shoulders, offering comfort without pressure. The silence between them was profound, filled with the unspoken weight of their fractured reality. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of their union, now served as a silent witness to the wreckage of their dreams. But in the shared quiet, amidst the debris of shattered expectations, a spark of something new, tentative, fragile, but undeniably present, flickered to life. The path to redemption wouldn't be easy, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was a path they could begin to walk together. The following morning, sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the gauzy curtains of Eleanor's hotel suite. The remnants of the wedding cake lay forgotten on a silver platter, a stark reminder of the previous night's shattering events. Eleanor, dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, a far cry from her wedding gown, stared out at the city awakening below. The grandeur felt distant, almost unreal. A soft knock on the door. It was Isabel. She carried a tray laden with tea and croissants, a small gesture of unexpected kindness. I couldn't sleep, Isabel said, her voice quiet. I wanted to apologize for everything. Eleanor turned, her eyes red-rimmed. Apologize? You exposed my life, my family. Isabel winced. We had reasons. Marcus and I, we saw injustice. We were trying to right a wrong, even if it was messy. Eleanor sat down, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing heavily on her. The aroma of the croissants did little to soothe the turmoil within her. I'm not sure there's a right way to expose someone's carefully constructed life, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. I know, Isabel admitted, her gaze falling. But we believed you deserved to know the truth. About your parentage, about everything. A long silence followed, broken only by the distant city sounds. The weight of their shared history settled between them, a heavy blanket woven from secrets and betrayals. Isabel's words, while tinged with regret, carried a sincerity that touched Eleanor. The revelation of her true parentage had fractured her life. Yes, but it had also offered a glimmer of freedom. The freedom to define her own path, unbound by the gilded cage of expectation. I needed to hear the truth, Eleanor finally whispered, her voice breaking slightly, even if it hurt. Isabel nodded, a small, hesitant smile gracing her lips. Perhaps, she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its former strength. Some hurts are necessary for healing. The croissants remained untouched on the tray between them, a testament to the depth of their shared experience. The day ahead promised more challenges, more difficult conversations. But for now, a fragile understanding, a nascent truce, had begun to bloom. The shattered pieces of their lives lay scattered, yet in the shared silence, in the quiet acknowledgement of shared pain and a tentative path toward healing, they had found a common ground. The opulent ballroom, now deserted save for the lingering scent of lilies and champagne, felt vast and echoing. Eleanor, alone amidst the scattered rose petals and discarded confetti, traced the intricate pattern of the carpet with her shoe. The champagne flute she held, still half full, felt cold and heavy in her hand. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket woven from betrayal, confusion, and a nascent sense of freedom. Julian found her there, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored her own. He didn't approach immediately, instead watching her from the doorway, his eyes filled with a hesitant blend of sorrow and something akin to hope. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice low and rough. I wanted to apologize. Eleanor didn't turn. For what, Julian? For the way you reacted? For the unspoken judgment in your eyes when the truth came out? He moved closer, the plush carpet muffling his footsteps. For all of it. For my preconceived notions. For my blindness. I let society's expectations blind me to who you truly are. He paused, his gaze intense. And I'm sorry I almost let it cost me everything. Eleanor finally turned, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Everything? She whispered, the question hanging in the air between them. The lingering scent of lilies seemed to intensify, almost suffocating. Yes, he said firmly, stepping closer, his hand reaching out, hesitant yet hopeful. Everything, because finding out the truth about you, it shattered my assumptions, but it also revealed the incredible strength and resilience you possess. His touch was gentle, tentative, as his fingers brushed against hers. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. I don't know what to think, Julian. Everything I believed about my life, my family, it's all gone. He cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping away the tear. It's okay to feel lost, he said softly, his voice filled with a compassion that surprised her. But you're not alone, and you don't have to face this alone. A glimmer of understanding, a spark of hope, ignited in Eleanor's eyes. The grandeur of the ballroom, the weight of the past, seemed to fade slightly. The future remained uncertain, but in Julian's gentle touch, in the shared silence between them, she saw a path toward healing, a possibility of rebuilding, not just her identity, but their relationship, on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. The untouched champagne flute felt lighter now, the cold less daunting. A new dawn, however uncertain, was breaking. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the gap in the heavy drapes of Eleanor's hotel suite, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The opulent room, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night, felt strangely empty. Eleanor, curled on the plush sofa, clutched a crumpled tissue, the faint scent of lilies clinging to it. The champagne, the apologies, the hesitant touch, all felt distant, dreamlike. A soft knock echoed through the suite. It was Isabel. The twin, her usual sharp edge softened by a hesitant weariness, entered carrying a tray laden with coffee and pastries. I didn't know how you'd be, Isabel said, her voice barely a whisper. The guilt etched on her face was palpable. Eleanor managed a weak smile. Coffee sounds good, she murmured, taking a mug. The warmth spread through her, a small comfort against the lingering chill of uncertainty. We didn't intend for things to escalate like this, Marcus said, entering behind Isabel. He looked genuinely remorseful. We just wanted you to know the truth. Eleanor sighed, taking a slow sip of coffee. I know, she said quietly, and I thank you for that. The words felt heavy, laden with unspoken complexities. The revelation had shattered her carefully constructed life, yet it had also granted her a freedom she hadn't known she craved. Isabel and Marcus exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement of their shared responsibility. The weight of their actions seemed to have settled upon them, muting their usual vibrancy. The press is already having a field day, Marcus said, his voice laced with apprehension. Our actions, they've created a huge scandal. Eleanor nodded, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. Let them, she said, surprising even herself with her strength. The truth has a way of cutting through the noise. She looked at the twins, her gaze steady. I'm not going to let this define me. I'll decide who I am, not society. The words, though soft, resonated with newfound conviction. The room fell silent, filled only with the quiet clinking of spoons against china and a shared sense of unease mixed with fragile hope. The future remained unwritten, but a subtle shift had occurred. The path forward was no longer shadowed by deception, but illuminated by a shared understanding, forged in the crucible of truth. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Thorne estate. Eleanor, alone on the terrace overlooking the now silent wedding venue, felt the chill wind bite despite the warmth of the late summer day. The remnants of the lavish decorations lay scattered, forlorn witnesses to the spectacular implosion of her perfect wedding. The scent of lilies, once so intoxicating, now felt suffocating, a constant reminder of the shattered illusion. A hand gently touched her shoulder. Julian. He looked weary, the usual sharp lines of his face softened by a profound sadness. He didn't speak, just stood beside her, sharing the silent weight of the past 24 hours. I didn't know, he finally whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. About your family. Eleanor turned, her gaze meeting his. Neither did I, she replied, her voice flat, devoid of any trace of the bubbly excitement she'd projected just hours before. The truth, raw and brutal, hung heavy between them, an insurmountable chasm. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, uncertain. She didn't pull away. I was a fool, he confessed, his eyes filled with a genuine remorse that transcended societal expectations. I let my prejudices blind me. A tear escaped Eleanor's eye, tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of heartbreak, not entirely. It was a tear of relief, of finally shedding the burden of a life lived under a carefully constructed facade. It wasn't just you, Julian, she said softly. I was complicit. I wanted to believe the lie as much as anyone. Silence descended again, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the uncertain future. Yet, in the shared silence, a fragile hope began to bloom. The path ahead remained unclear, fraught with challenges. But for the first time, Eleanor felt a flicker of strength, a quiet determination to forge her own path, independent of social standing, of expectations, of lies. The truth, though painful, had set her free, and in the quiet solidarity of shared sorrow with Julian, she glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of love, one built on honesty and mutual understanding, a love that could weather the storm. The grand ballroom, once glittering with champagne bubbles and laughter, now felt cavernous and cold. Crystal chandeliers, like frozen tears, reflected the bleakness in Eleanor's eyes. The lingering scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, mocked her shattered dreams. Isabel and Marcus, observing from a shadowed alcove, exchanged a look of uneasy regret. Their carefully orchestrated plan had worked, but the collateral damage was far greater than anticipated. Julian approached Eleanor, his usual composure fractured. The crisp lines of his tailored suit couldn't disguise the tremor in his hands as he offered her a glass of water. Eleanor, he began, his voice catching. He couldn't meet her gaze, his eyes fixated on the discarded bouquet, its once perfect roses now wilting. Eleanor accepted the water, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed his. The touch, once charged with anticipation, now felt fragile, almost ephemeral. Don't, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the muted hum of the emptying ballroom. Don't say anything you'll regret. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, regrets, and the ghost of what could have been. Isabel stepped forward, her face etched with a mixture of remorse and defiance. We didn't mean for it to turn out like this, she said, her voice strained. We just wanted. Marcus placed a hand on his sister's arm, silencing her. He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a surprising empathy. We were driven by our own pain, our own sense of injustice, he explained, his voice low and sincere. But seeing the hurt we caused, it's unbearable. Eleanor finally met Julian's gaze. Her eyes, though filled with sorrow, held a newfound strength. The weight of deception, of a life lived under a false pretense, was finally lifting. It's not your fault, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I have to take responsibility for my own choices. The admission was a turning point, a quiet declaration of independence. The carefully constructed facade, so diligently maintained, was crumbling, replaced by a burgeoning sense of self. The night had shattered her illusions, yes, but it had also freed her. The seeds of a new beginning were being sown, amidst the wreckage of a perfect wedding gone wrong. The future was uncertain, yet, for the first time, it felt genuinely hers. The champagne flutes, abandoned on silver platters, reflected the fractured light of the dawn. A single, wilted rose lay discarded on the plush carpet, a stark reminder of the shattered fairy tale. Eleanor, eyes red-rimmed but resolute, stood by the vast window, the city skyline a blurry watercolor in the pre-dawn gloom. The weight of the previous night, the crushing revelation of her parentage, hadn't broken her. It had forged something new. A quiet strength emanated from her, a stark contrast to the fragile bride she'd been hours before. Julian entered, his face etched with remorse. The carefully constructed wall of emotional detachment had crumbled, revealing a vulnerability that surprised even himself. He approached her cautiously, his hands clasped in front of him. "Eleanor," he began, his voice husky, I'm so sorry. I reacted poorly. I let my prejudices dictate my response." Eleanor turned, her gaze unwavering. "It wasn't just your reaction, Julian," she said, her voice low but firm. "It was years of ingrained beliefs, of societal pressures. We both played our parts in this tragedy." She paused, a sigh escaping her lips. "But," she continued, her voice softening slightly, "I'm not angry, not anymore. The anger, it's replaced by something else." He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, yet filled with genuine remorse. The contact sparked a flicker of recognition, a memory of the connection that had drawn them together, a connection that ran deeper than the superficial trappings of their social circles. Isabel and Marcus watched from the hallway, their initial triumph replaced by a sobering realization of the impact of their actions. The guilt was palpable, etched onto their faces. They had exposed a truth, but at what cost? Had they truly helped Eleanor, or simply ripped apart her carefully constructed world? The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken, yet profoundly understood. The weight of their actions threatened to overwhelm them. The planned retribution felt hollow. The victory tasted like ash. Their secret, once a weapon, now felt like a burden, a painful reminder of the line they'd crossed. The morning light exposed the emptiness of their cynical game. The faint sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Eleanor's biological parents entered, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hope. The scene held a strange mixture of grief and burgeoning reconciliation, a testament to the chaotic dance of truth and consequence. The dawn, breaking through the city's haze, held the promise of a new beginning, a beginning far from perfect, but undeniably authentic. The glittering ballroom, once a symbol of aspiration, now stood as a silent witness to the unraveling and eventual rebuilding of a life. The city lights, a shimmering tapestry below, did little to soothe Eleanor's turmoil. The champagne's effervescence felt mocking now, its celebratory fizz a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal clinging to her tongue. Julian's apology, though heartfelt, felt insufficient, a bandage on a gaping wound. She turned from the window, the cool glass a welcome contrast to the burning heat in her eyes. "It wasn't just about the money, Julian," she whispered, her voice raspy from unshed tears. "It was about who I am, or rather, who I thought I was." She ran a hand through her hair, the gesture betraying the fragility beneath her newfound resolve. Julian's remorse deepened. He saw the cracks in her carefully constructed facade, the vulnerability that lay beneath the polished exterior. He understood now the weight of her carefully maintained composure, the burden of a secret life finally revealed. "I know," he said, his voice thick with regret, "and I'm trying to understand." He reached for her hand again, this time his touch more confident, less hesitant. A quiet strength emanated from his gesture, a mirroring of the quiet strength Eleanor had found within herself. Isabel and Marcus, observing from the shadows of the hallway, felt a pang of something akin to empathy. The smug satisfaction of their victory had long since evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The cold calculation that had driven their actions felt hollow now, the echoes of their triumph sounding like the whispers of a haunting regret. Their faces, once alight with triumph, were now etched with the stark reality of the consequences. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, heavy and inescapable. The elaborate charade, the carefully orchestrated reveal, now felt like a cruel joke, one that left a bitter taste in their mouths. The arrival of Eleanor's biological parents brought a new dimension to the strained atmosphere. Their faces, etched with worry and uncertainty, held a complex mixture of fear and hope. The air crackled with anticipation, charged with unspoken questions and nascent reconciliation. This wasn't the end, but a pivot, a turning point toward a future still uncertain, yet brimming with the potential for healing and forgiveness. The first rays of dawn, breaking through the city's haze, illuminated not only the ballroom but also the path ahead, a path fraught with challenges. Yes, but also filled with the promise of a new beginning. The hushed tones of the reconciliation felt brittle, a fragile peace hanging in the pre-dawn air. Eleanor, pale but resolute, accepted her biological mother's embrace, a hesitant touch that spoke volumes of unspoken years. The scent of lilies, still clinging to the opulent ballroom, now mingled with the sharp tang of unshed tears. Julian, his face etched with a weariness that belied his usual composure, watched the scene unfold, a silent observer in his own drama. He saw the raw vulnerability in Eleanor's eyes, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed facade he'd known. I never knew," her mother whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "The pain you carried." Eleanor nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The weight of years of deception, of living a lie, seemed to lessen, replaced by a burgeoning sense of self-acceptance. Isabel and Marcus approached cautiously. We wanted to apologize," Isabel began, her voice hesitant. The bravado of the previous day was gone, replaced by a genuine remorse. "We didn't foresee the full impact of our actions." Eleanor nodded, a small, understanding smile playing on her lips. "I know," she said softly, "but it forced a reckoning, a necessary one." She looked out the vast windows at the cityscape, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. "I've spent so long trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. This has freed me." Marcus, his usually sharp eyes softened, added, "We acted impulsively. We should have considered the consequences more carefully." "You did what you felt was right," Eleanor responded, her gaze meeting his. "And in a way, you were." She paused, then continued, "I needed to know the truth, even if it was painful. Now, I can finally start building my own life, on my own terms." Julian entered, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. He approached slowly, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions visibly etched on him. He stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to proceed. "Eleanor," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor rose, her eyes meeting his. The lingering hurt was undeniable, but there was also a sense of understanding, of shared experience. "I'm not angry, Julian," she stated, her voice steady, surprisingly calm. "Just disappointed. In myself, mostly." She spoke with a quiet strength that had been forged in the crucible of the last 24 hours. She paused, then said, "But I forgive you." The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a mixture of sorrow and a tentative hope. The vast ballroom, a symbol of unattainable dreams just hours before, now felt less like a gilded cage and more like a neutral space, a place where a new beginning could tentatively begin. The sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the polished floor, painting a new scene of quiet hope. The future was uncertain, but the weight of the past had lessened, replaced by a tentative, yet poignant freedom.